So we can keep things moving. Lunch is coming up, and I think we've got, I'm hoping, one of the most energetic speakers of the day who's going to take us into lunchtime. Chris Rowland is no stranger to being provocative and controversial. He is written for us at Passcode, and he's a Passcode influencer, which is a group of 100-plus people who we ask tough questions to every month or so. And Chris has been a great contributor to that. He's going to talk about how hackers are taking advantage of some of the things that we've been exploring this morning. You should know about a thing or two about how hackers think. After all, you hacked the Pentagon when you were how old?
It's alleged.
Allegedly hacked the Pentagon. Never mind. That was completely. Anyway, so without further ado, Chris Rowland, thanks.
That's perfect. Thank you. Great. Thanks for that warm introduction, and CSM Passcode and Security Ledger putting this on. Really excited to be here. It is literally an old home week with your third X-Force presenter in a row. It's actually really surprising, but also makes me happy that something I put together for the founders of ISS 17 years ago is still running strong. So I was recruited to build this team called the X-Force in 1998, and really became an anchor of vulnerability research, and excited that it's still going with IBM. And my new company is entirely focused on security of the IoT. And so it's a very exciting new space. There's really only a few startups out there focusing on it. And so I'm going to give a bit of a breadth topic on IoT security, and then kind of wrap up with where we think security for the IoT ends up in the enterprise. So just a brief bit of internet security history. The first prior to computer hacking, we had people taking advantage of telephone systems, telephone freaks, Captain Crunch discovering that he could manipulate the switches with 2600 hertz tones, red boxes, etc. This kind of led to the 80s, where I took a personal interest in information security, and we started to see our first malware. We saw the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act in 1988. We saw really the first big piece of malcode that really disabled the internet, the Morris worm, and our first indictments for computer crime with Kevin Poulsen, who's now gone on to be a fantastic journalist in the space. And I don't know if you're familiar with that hack. He manipulated the Los Angeles radio systems to win a Porsche 944 S2 by being caller number 100, which in hindsight seems somewhat victimless compared to the type of massive fraud we see today. We started to see hackers organize. There were chat rooms on the internet, chat rooms over X25, and it's interesting, a lot of the folks that I knew from back then are now CEOs or founders of multiple startup security communities, including ones up here. I remember my first virus cleanup at work was actually the Stone virus, then Michelangelo. Really I think the inflection point that really created the need for gateway antivirus was Melissa. I certainly remember where I was sitting when the Melissa worm came out and shut down everyone's mail gateway. But additionally, the 90s were really where we started to see remote exploitation of computer systems. So previously, we'd seen people dialing in, kind of breaking in with default usernames and passwords, et cetera. But with the availability of the packet sniffer to the general public, the ability to inspect network traffic, we saw it was a watershed event, and it allowed people to break into computers remotely over networks, over the internet, and spawned the business and the concept of responsible disclosure. And I was just looking when I was sitting down. My first vulnerability disclosure I was involved with was in 1991. So I've been doing this for a little while. In the 2000s, we started to see Big targets, still not quite the fraud we're seeing today, but we'd see DDoS attacks on IPO days. We started to see very fast-moving, self-propagating code. SQL Slammer, I was one of the discoverers of them, actually named. Code Red was another one. But these were non-revenue generating pieces of malcode. They were just out there, I think, for people to show they could do things, or perhaps some theses that maybe they were tests for information warfare. And really now we're in a totally different environment. Last year we had 6 companies that were in the $100 million club, which was over $100 million in damages. We started to see nation-state attacks that involve hardware damage and very widespread embedded vulnerabilities, as Josh was mentioning previously, that are still embedded in devices and will be there for n number of years that are perhaps unpatchable. Looking forward to 2020, it reminds me very much of 1990. We're looking at billions of devices with a very low level of security built in. And a simple metaphor is, if I'm the product manager for Fitbit, am I worried about it being safe and secure, or am I worried about getting that product out in time for Christmas? And I think we have a bit of a challenge in that the device manufacturers are more incented to push devices than they are to make sure they're perfectly safe. I'd encourage you to go to Alibaba.com and search for something like an Apple Watch. Why buy one for $400 when you can buy 20 clones for $10 a piece? And the influx of Chinese knockoffs of IoT devices is yet to be seen, but you'll soon be able to buy an Android watch in your gas station for $5, probably preloaded with malware. Again, early days in the internet remind me of where we are today in the IoT. One of the first servers I installed was Senate.gov. I put in their mail server, and I put it in their Gopher server. And Senator Kennedy said, I heard about this thing called the web. Can you put it in a web server? No one else wanted it. Of course, I wanted to install it, so I put one in. But imagine if we had Gopher servers today instead of web servers. It would be a different world. As with these other protocols, there are only a half dozen protocols here, but when I get to my IoT slide, you'll see we're looking at over 100. But imagine a world today where we were running Novell IPX SPX or Banyan Vines. It would look totally different. The fact that TCP/IP happened to be the standard and happened to win really changed the world. But interconnecting Sun Microsystems, Novell, AppleTalk, it was not only a huge technology challenge, but I bet if we took the hackers today with their skill set and let them loose on that 1990 software, it would be torn to shreds because there was very little thought to security. Here, your local boys from Cambridge are quite famous. Someone in marketing dug up this picture of my first security talk, which was at a Usenix conference in 1997. But in the 80s and 90s, I think the computer hackers were really exploratory and learning. And I think that's really moved to the vulnerability research community. And conversely, today, if you look at these security conferences, I was just out at DEF CON, 50,000 attendees. I mean, we're talking about 100 people in the 80s, and the information security community has become giant, as has the business of computer fraud. So a couple of recent IoT hacks that I wanted to talk through, this one came out of DEF CON, and one of the things we're starting to see is a real mix of radio frequency attacks with device attacks. And historically, computer networks have been attacked over networks, over Ethernet networks, over the Big I internet, over Wi-Fi. And as we move to smaller devices with lower power and lower bandwidth requirements, we see them moving to different protocols and different frequencies that we really have no visibility into and not many people have looked at. And without eyes on those technologies, there are going to be vulnerabilities found there. So Fontana was a very interesting research project out of a Columbia professor, and he actually was able to modify the firmware of a printer to exfiltrate data in the AM and FM frequencies in such a fashion that it would penetrate a 2-foot wall bunker. And so now we're not worried about a backdoor per se. You're talking about firmware that can be embedded in a printer that can exfiltrate data from a network. This is a totally different problem that we've dealt with, and is really, I use the term RF data leakage. We're seeing these IoT devices leak data through wireless spectrum that we've never seen or had access to. Cellular hacking, I see this as the rogue Wi-Fi of the 2010s. You all remember probably in the early 2000s when Wi-Fi became very popular. As a security practitioner, one of the first questions of the CISOs, do you have any Wi-Fi hotspots? Of course not, it's against our policy. And certainly almost every corporation had rogue Wi-Fi hotspots. There's well-established tools and technologies to detect and eliminate those hotspots. But today we're starting to see the emergence of the rogue cell station. And we've not seen it mainstream yet, but we have definitely seen it in the wild. The government's gotten a lot of static about it, about some of their collection techniques using the DRT boxes, which is a $500,000 rogue cell tower effectively. But they don't cost $500,000 anymore. You can build one for about $500. And this is a guy at the ShmooCon conference who took over about 500 people's cell phone using this Yagi antenna. Now, if you think about what we depend on cellular for today, a rogue cell tower in the right place requesting a PIN reset for your password, whether it's for your bank or your two-factor Google, all of a sudden you've got a man-in-the-middle attack who can compromise your entire account and infrastructure. And so I see this being a serious issue, and the ability to detect these types of threats, again, is very new. No one's really thought about inventing technologies to prevent and detect the emergence of a rogue cellular tower in the enterprise. And these are things we need to start to think about, and there's a huge opportunity, I think, for innovation in this space. ProxyHam was the paper drama du jour, or per annum at the DEF CON conference. Every year since 2005, there's been a paper that's had a temporary restraining order placed against it or mysteriously disappeared from the DEF CON agenda. There was never actually a straight answer on this one. I didn't see it as that big a deal. Actually, one of my engineers ended up presenting on something similar anyway. But the point is we're seeing more and more of this as well. ProxyHam is a Wi-Fi proxy that takes a Wi-Fi access point and transmits it over a different frequency that's not detectable by most security systems. This one up to 2 miles away. A second version was released with a prepaid SIM in it, so you could be anywhere in the world accessing a network via Wi-Fi. And so more and more we're seeing this hybrid model of connected devices using wireless technologies that we're unaccustomed to attack and exfiltrate data. And it's important to track what is going on at these conferences, because it's a harbinger as to what will come in the real world and in real threat vectors. And at least I'd say a third of the talks we see today at these conferences are using technology like this. 5 years ago, there were zero. I happened to be present when this vulnerability was found. I was hanging out at the Internet of Things Village all weekend at DEF CON. It was pretty awesome. And Samsung donated their latest refrigerator. It came with an SSL certificate in it, and it ignored it. And we see this as a common theme. We saw it with BMW's update system. We saw it with the Samsung fridge. Samsung actually was pretty cool to donate this and get it out there and fixed ahead of time. But this refrigerator actually logs into your Google Calendar. So your refrigerator now has your Google credentials, and then they had no SSL protection on it. So if that product had gone live unpatched, this is literally where you can have refrigerators compromising enterprises via credentials. This was one of my favorite talks at Black Hat. The Globalstar Network, some of you may not have heard of it. It's been up for a while. It's used for, I actually have a Globalstar phone. But it's also used by the SPOTS location system, which is a personal location system. It's not as commonly known. It's used by most armored truck vehicles to track their routes, to detect if they go off route, if there's an armored truck robbery. And a researcher from SYNAC named Colby Moore reverse engineered this satellite protocol. and determined that they were transmitting via HTTP, as in no S. This is 2015. We should not be transmitting our GPS coordinates to the world via HTTP. And again, it's an example where eyes have not been put upon these devices because they're things, not software. And so I see a huge opportunity to look for rogue emitters, rogue devices like this, and secure them. And these are incredibly, a space system is a very difficult system to get out there and patch. This was a talk I saw 2 years ago, really kind of got me fired up on starting this company. It was two Italian researchers, and in pure Italian style, they got on stage at Hack in the Box in Amsterdam, dressed as sailors, and had the man overboard sensor from a ship. And they used a $1,000 software-defined radio running in the FM frequency band to take over the digital signal and tell the ship that someone had fallen overboard. Now, that's a big deal if you're taking your ship by Somalia, because that automatically disengages your autopilot and puts the ship in a holding pattern. And so, again, while you might not consider a maritime system on the IoT, we're really looking at the same problems that we've heard about in the last talks in the automotive systems. We've heard a lot of talk about aviation systems, and as we look in these embedded devices across these many verticals, we're going to see serious vulnerabilities. But the ability to actually remotely stop a ship with $1,000 worth of hardware is very disconcerting. I kind of jokingly call it the Somali Pirates Toolkit. They don't have them. The year previous, and there's been a lot of work done in this area, is around aviation security, and specifically around the ADS-B, ACARS, and flight management systems. They're insecure. They're running at 1090 megahertz. And whereas 10 years ago, it would have taken $1 million a piece of equipment to detect or inject traffic into these, you can actually receive this traffic with a $6 dongle you can buy on Amazon called an RTL 2832. And with a transmitter, it's been demonstrated you can inject ghost traffic into the airspace. I threw this in here after hearing the GE talk today. If you guys are kind enough to take one slide update, but there was actually just in July a disclosure on 3 manufacturers of wind turbines connected to the internet that had zero-day vulnerabilities in their control systems. And these were detected, they were found with the Shodan system, which means they were connected to the open internet. And so talk about IoT with a big T, someone being able to attack a wind turbine could certainly disable or cause a lot of damage or affect the power infrastructure. And so it's great to see people finding these things. I'm a big fan of the Shodan work. But again, we're seeing these embedded systems being designed without security in mind. I took this screenshot this morning. This is the airspace of this room. This is a lower chunk of the ISM band. Specifically, I was looking at Bluetooth, and what you can see here is the first 12 channels of Bluetooth and the emitters here transmitting through here. And I thought it was an interesting kind of way to visualize the IoT wirelessly as opposed to through typical connected fashion. So if you recall my slide with 6 computer protocols from the 90s, now we're dealing with well over 100 protocols in the IoT. And as Josh mentioned, in his question, these devices, once they're deployed, will exist for 20 to 30 years. Once you install a generator or a chiller or some other critical piece of infrastructure that's running Zigbee or Z-Wave or some other industrial control protocol, these devices now have joined the IoT. And what's challenging from an information security perspective is that typically the CIO is not responsible for them. The CISO doesn't know they exist. and we need to be able to provide visibility and find these. Samsung recently got dinged for their smart TV. If you saw, their smart TV happens to have the feature of recording every word in the room. I haven't looked at the new Amazon device, but I suspect it may have some similar functionality. Yeah, my gut is I think we'll begin to settle down on some of these protocols, hopefully things like 6LoWPAN with some good security in there. But unfortunately, unlike the 90s where we were pretty easily able to move off things like IPX, SPX, with Banyan Vines and NIS within a period of 10 years, I think a lot of these older protocols will be in existence ad infinitum, and we'll have to find ways to deal with them in the environment and infrastructure. So as we enter this world, everything is becoming connected, and I haven't talked about privacy. Certainly privacy is a top concern, and one of the taglines I like to use is that in many IoT devices, especially wearables, or in online services that are free, you really are the product. One example I saw this, the first real example that really caught my attention was the Jawbone paper on California earthquake last year. There was an earthquake in California, and engineer Jawbone wrote a paper. He tracked the spread of the earthquake based on when people woke up. And it was a very interesting technical paper, but it made me realize, well, Jawbone's allowed to tell anybody when I wake up. And I had our counsel for free review the Fitbit and Jawbone licenses, and certainly that is the case. That information is theirs, and they may do with it as they please. And so I do think that's the FTC's job to look into. I hope to see some optionality in the way we license those technologies, something such as micropayments. Say, okay, I'd rather pay 99 cents a month to have my wearable data become anonymized. Asset tracking, both in the physical and life cycle, automation analytics, devices are being tagged everywhere. It's a massive improvement to logistics, but also gives up a fair amount of privacy information and also opens up opportunity for exploitation and fraud. These are all pivots into potential enterprises as we start to tag everything from diapers to boxes with IoT emitters. And the connection between these assets, between these wearables, will eventually lead to compromises in the infrastructure. And so while we haven't had that watershed Melissa moment today, we will see a Samsung device infect your wearable, compromise your phone, and get into your enterprise. And so while MDM has effectively covered the legitimate users' devices in the enterprise, there's really no solution for everything else that's in the enterprise. And I think that there's a big opportunity to address that. And it really it comes down to a new generation of insider threat. When we talk about insider threat today, we like to think about the scary guy from Anonymous who got a job as a sysadmin specifically to own your systems. But millennials today compose a huge portion of the workforce. They compose over half of it. This is my first startup that's almost all millennials. And when privately interviewed, not at my company, this is other sources, 70% of millennials willfully disregard internet IT policy. And they say, okay, I read it, I don't care, I'm gonna violate it. And so we will have to view this wearable connected generation as a potential insider threat and look for mitigation techniques against these more and more devices that will continue to enter the workplace. When interviewed, risk versus reward, I suspect that today most information security policies are really built around how boomers and Gen Xers think about cybersecurity. And if you look at these numbers on boomers versus millennials, it is dramatic. And if you're building an information security policy, a BYOD policy, or happen to choose to invent an IoT policy, I have yet to see one yet, you need to be thinking about the millennials, not the boomers, because these are the guys these are the ones that are breaking the rules, and we need to figure out a way to mitigate this threat. Again, around privacy, I mentioned wearables. We've seen multiple civil cases already. Wearable data is subpoenable. I don't think a lot of people think about that when they strap one on. We've seen civil cases around people on disability who were exercising already. We're seeing the wearable data used in criminal cases. And I don't know that most people know that when they sign up or strap on that wearable. Additionally, the insurance business, I think this is a parallel with track with the automotive industry. I think in the next 5 years, our cars will be strongly incentivized to put cameras and speed sensors in our cars that report our behavior to our insurance companies. And arguably, what will they do with that data? And can they actually keep that data secure? History repeats itself. They will not be able to. Just some kind of indirect enterprise impacts. Smart cities. I recently joined a partnership with Kaspersky and IOActive on smart cities. I think there's a huge opportunity. Obviously, I think in the big picture, the advantages of the IoT greatly outweigh the security risks today, but we do need to stay ahead of them. But we're seeing more and more fragile devices being exploited. There's another talk coming up. Cesar Cerruto, I think, is talking in Boston later this month about hacking traffic lights. Parking meters are being targeted. So all the components of the smart city, which are IoT connected, really designed to improve quality of life, water meters, et cetera. We're seeing more and more disclosures to the ICS certs, and we're seeing more risk, but I also see this as a huge opportunity for innovation. Connected health, again, obviously, is already a tremendous improvement to life, whether you can have someone perform telesurgery or diagnose you remotely or use your Uber doctor to come to your house in an hour for $99. But conversely, we're seeing constant attacks on medical devices, and there's a litany of them. You can't go through them. Certainly some of the work I think the Cavalry is doing around medical devices will really drive responsible behavior in the development of those. But conversely, today we've got a situation where it's been demonstrated an MRI machine can easily be bricked with a malformed packet. Now, one bricked MRI machine isn't the end of the world, but if all the MRI machines in your city are bricked, you have a serious health issue. Transportation, logistics, aviation, again, we've seen a lot of press around this. I think a fair amount of that press, it was kind of a bit debatable or dubious as to how much exploitation actually occurred, and I look forward to seeing some real vulnerability research being done here. But we are seeing embedded devices being targeted. My solution to the recent United Airlines debacle was to ban Ethernet cables for TSA. I think an Ethernet cable on an airline is probably more dangerous than a Swiss Army knife, personally. In conclusion, BYOD policy is simply not enough. Everyone's got a BYOD policy today. I don't think the CISO who doesn't let anybody bring a personal device into work is probably going to have a very short career. And so that we do need to have policies that allow for a modern lifestyle. Conversely, you don't want those devices on your network, and you don't want devices that you're not witting to on your network or in your environment. And so I think one key thing for 2016 and 17 is for enterprises to think about their IoT policy and perhaps as separate to their BYOD policy, because there really, really are different problems. Engaging the board, some of us in our careers now are starting to get that tap on the shoulder to join the board of directors to be the security guy. Not many people are taking that job. It's not a seat many people want to be in because it's the first person likely to get sued. But the board has to be engaged. It can't just be something stuck under the CISO or CTO. And I think with these existential attacks, whether it's Target or Ashley Madison, these existential attacks will require the board to put as much emphasis on cybersecurity as they do on, say, audit or other parts of the business. And embracing this technology responsibly is key. So that's my wrap up. I'd be happy to take any Q&A. Kind of went through a big breadth of different attack vectors on IoT and perhaps some solutions to the enterprise.
That was a great session. Thank you.
Thanks.
Are you looking at, I mean, we've talked about policy and we've talked about kind of best practices. Are you looking at this from a mitigation or intrusion from the front end, start on the front end of setting up a testing practice? How would you help us with that?
I think the first step that is just as with our first computer networks is situational awareness. And today there is no situational awareness to the IoT. No one knows what the heck is in their building, just like no one knew when they had a rogue hotspot. No one knew they had an old 4633 sitting in the basement running an old version of SQL Server until the thing lit up with SQL Slammer and took down your whole network. And that forced people to map their networks. People are going to have to map their airspace now to look for devices, and there's an opportunity for new technologies to be built there. And so the first step is SA. And the next step, I think, is mitigation. You know, who does actually stop people from bringing devices into work? There may have secure places like data centers, call centers, trading floors. They will enforce anti-IoT and BYOD policies. They do not want those devices there, and it's appropriate. And so that will be a balance, I think, to find. But situational awareness is first, and I truly think we are where we were about 20 years ago with IoT, and we need to get ahead of it.
You talked about a wide array of topics, let's say. When you think about the typical IoT ecosystem with platform providers there, with device manufacturers there, with connectivity providers there, with service providers there, can you elaborate a bit, like, for example, the problem of intrusions? How would you split responsibilities between all of those different roles?
Well, I mean, EE Times yesterday just did a really interesting piece on low-powered IoT connectivities, and it was another 15 protocols I hadn't even heard of. And so it's adding to the problem. We're adding more and more protocols, and I really love the ones that say proprietary, because we know they'll be problematic. So you've got the device, IoT creates a three-dimensional attack surface. You've got the device, you've got the communications, and you've got cloud provisioning now. Historically, when we rolled out a web server, we were about port 80 and 443. It was a pretty simple attack surface. Now we've got 3 attack surfaces, and then maybe throw on your mobile apps. You've got your Android app and your iOS app that in many cases could be written by 2 different outsourced companies. And so the attack surface multiplies. So there is no single place that bears a responsibility. There are certainly different reasons to have different protocols. Some IoT devices are fine with 8 kilobits per second bandwidth. Some of them are going to need 5 gigahertz or 5G transmission capabilities with multi-gigabit connectivity. It's going to vary by application, and so there will be a need for a few different types of protocols. I think the ones that will hopefully win are the ones that use peer review methods. I think they'll need to use strong crypto and the implementation of keys, where we saw Samsung implement strong crypto but forgot to turn it on. So the load is shared.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.
Great, thank you.
Give a hand to Chris Rulin, CEO of Biscayne.